I'm sure you've heard about how books can change the world and bring about a better future, but have you heard about how books can change the past? Literally change the past? Yeah, it's great that books can change the world and bring about a better future. You can write some nonfiction book that changes a lot of people's minds and gets people out in the streets. It mobilizes people around some central issue. That's great. I do believe in the profound ability of books to change the world. But what I'd rather talk to you about is how books can change the past. You could make a piece of art so good that you can literally go back in time and change events that already happened, or insert events that did not happen into the historical record by making a piece of art so creative and so good. I want to talk about a few pieces of fiction that sort of support this idea. First off, Homer's Iliad, the works of Homer, the Odyssey, and the Iliad. So when I was doing a little bit of research for this video, I thought Homer's Iliad would be the perfect place to start. I always thought the Iliad, it's about this Trojan War between Greece and Troy. And at the end of it, there's this big ass wooden horse that they fill with Greek soldiers. And this is how Greece wins the Trojan War. So I kind of thought about the Trojan War, like, yeah, this probably happened. I'm sure the Trojan War was a real historical event, but like the Trojan horse, this big wooden horse, that's kind of ridiculous. Like there's no way that happened. But through Homer's embellishing of the events of the Trojan War, a real thing that happened, but Homer's creative writing has kind of inserted the Trojan horse into the historical record. But it turns out that none of this shit happened at all. The Trojan War, there's actually no archaeological evidence of even a war occurring between Greece and Troy. This didn't happen at all. I imagine probably most everyone assumes Trojan War probably happened, but Trojan horse, yeah, this probably wasn't whatever, but no, it turns out all of this shit was made up, and Homer's retellings of the Iliad and the Odyssey, particularly the events of the Trojan War, was just through centuries of oral Greek tradition. However, Greek historians for centuries just assumed that the events of the Trojan War were real. This was essentially considered part of the historical record, that the Trojan War was real, that the Trojan horse was real. For hundreds and hundreds of years, this was understood to be fact in ancient Greece, and I would say Homer played a great part in this. He wrote a book that was so good, it was literally so entertaining and so captivating that he made the events of his book, the Trojan War, the Trojan horse, Odysseus being inside the Trojan horse. This became part of the historical record. And I think that's great. I think it's awesome that we can live in a world in which I believed for 27 years. It was my historical understanding of history that the Trojan War was real, and I was today years old when I learned that none of it actually happened. But I think it's great that we can live in a world where some guy named Homer, thousands of years ago, writes a poem that's so incredible that high school students for thousands of years read it in class and just assume that these events are mostly some level true. I think that's awesome. I think Homer is a great example of writing a piece of fiction that's so good that it literally becomes a part of actual history. Another piece of historical fiction that I would like to talk about is this book called I Saw Her That Night by Drago Jančar. He is a Slovenian author, and this story is about a woman named Veronika Zarnik who lives in Slovenia during World War II. She's like this bourgeois socialite from Ljubljana, and she ends up disappearing kind of in the turmoil of World War II, just tragic case of a civilian casualty. And where I think this book is so excellent is that it kind of takes the story of a real life woman. Veronika Zarnik was an actual person, but it gives her this sort of eccentric, larger than life persona in the book, and it brings her story to life. And I think something like historical fiction is so good for that. These were mostly real events that actually happened, but through Drago Jančar's incredible writing, he brings this story completely to life. I don't think I'm saying anything novel here about at least in this case, about this book, about historical fiction. I think anybody would agree that historical fiction is really, really good for bringing stories like this to life. I think the sort of brutal reality of war is that statistics of things like civilian casualties kind of gets flattened into just some emotionless number. But when you read a book like this and it brings these stories to life, it really can bring out profound emotions in you. It's probably the best book that you have not even remotely heard of. I highly recommend it. Another example of a piece of fiction that is so good that it changes history literally is Libra by Don DeLillo. This is my favorite book by Don DeLillo. It's absolutely incredible. It is basically a speculative biography about Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who assassinated John F. Kennedy. And it's based on real events, but Don DeLillo puts this sort of absurdist, postmodernist spin to Lee Harvey Oswald's life, and it's essentially a fictional biography of him. In the book, he's kind of this misfit, goofball dummy. He's a communist, and he has these sort of vaguely left-wing ideals, but he's kind of too dumb to really articulate them well or have any sort of coherent understanding of how to live with these left-wing ideals in America. So he defects to the Soviet Union. This was real. He did do this in real life. But this idiot, Lee Harvey Oswald of Don DeLillo's Libra, he's kind of such a moron. He moves to the USSR and he can't quite crack it there. He just kind of has a bummer of a time in the USSR, moves back to the US, and he kind of just throughout the whole novel is like this bumbling goofball misfit and sort of gets swept up into these insane circumstances and gets embroiled in this conspiracy to assassinate the president and just becomes this idiot, a dummy who's in the right place at the right time and makes it this enormous impact on one of the most earth-shattering events in world history of the last 100 years. I think this is one of my favorite examples of an artist or an author made a book that was so compelling. This is a wildly entertaining book, and to me, if I think about history pertaining to these events, if I think of Lee Harvey Oswald, this is the guy that I think of. I don't think of necessarily the Warren Commission version of Lee Harvey Oswald or the Wikipedia article about Lee Harvey Oswald or whatever. To me, my personal understanding of history, Lee Harvey Oswald is his character in Libra. I think through Don DeLillo's incredibly imaginative and effective writing and world building, he has kind of replaced the historical record for Lee Harvey Oswald with Libra and his character in that book. I would just say this is a much more entertaining and this is just a much more interesting understanding of history, to understand the guy in history as this character in the book. I think it's just a more colorful understanding of history to see Lee Harvey Oswald as this guy, the Lee Harvey Oswald, the Gary Oldman version of Lee Harvey Oswald from Oliver Stone's JFK / the goofball misfit from Don DeLillo's Libra, as opposed to the typically events through history are kind of boring. Like, it's why conspiracy theories are so intoxicating, because we want to have this more sort of whimsical, mystical, like fantastical understanding of the world around us, but most of the time it's actually a much more bleak, grim and boring reality that things kind of just happen that we don't have any control over, that the world around us can be quite sort of boring and dreary and not that interesting. Sometimes it literally is just a guy gets lucky, or something just happens and it sucks. Don DeLillo wrote a book so good that I think for anyone who reads Libra, this kind of just writes over that history of Lee Harvey Oswald and replaces it with Don DeLillo's most well-written character, Lee Harvey Oswald. This kind of overwrites the history as far as I'm concerned. And I would have to imagine any reader of Libra would feel the same way. Lastly, Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon takes place near the end, at the end of World War II, and it's about these a myriad of factions and characters, hundreds of characters who are trying to locate and track down some mysterious device that's related to the V-2 rockets developed by Nazi Germany. And there's all kinds of crazy things happening. For example, there's the closest you would say to a protagonist of this story, Tyrone Slothrop. He's like this sort of suave, charismatic womanizer who charts out a map of all of his erections in the London area at the end of World War II. Every time he has some sexual escapade, he marks it on the map of London. Eventually, some V-2 rocket researchers take their map of all the V2 rocket strikes in London and they place it over Tyrone Slothrop's erection map, and they find that there's a exact one-to-one correlation that effectively this guy Tyrone Slothrop, his erections predict V2 rocket blasts. It's just this insane book where completely ridiculous plot lines are inserted into this just extremely bleak period of time. And if I had to imagine the sort of immediate months after World War II, it's probably very boring and administrative. But Thomas Pynchon through this book kind of inserts a lot of whimsicality into it. Another interesting thing about this book is this was written in the 1960s, and Pynchon kind of really imparts this 60s countercultural ethos into World War II. So there's rampant drug use, drug experimentation. It's very much a book that is a product of the 60s, but it takes place in the 1940s. So I think that's an example of just a really sort of a really interesting take on world events. I wouldn't say this has replaced my historical understanding of World War II, but I can't possibly think about a V2 rocket without thinking about this book. It has basically fundamentally altered my understanding of Europe, or as the novel refers to it, the interzone. I would say this is probably the peak of historical fiction, the guy who's most nasty with the pen when it comes to writing historical fiction. Maybe check it out. I wouldn't say I'll reread this someday. It's an extremely difficult book, and I'm not sure it's super enjoyable, but it's, I understand it to be one of the best out there. Yeah, I hope I was able to kind of close the loop on this idea. I think it's a much more enjoyable way to interpret events of the past through this lens of creative fiction. I think it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in 2025. It does not matter if the Trojan War literally happened or not. It doesn't technically matter if the Trojan horse was a real thing. I think it's just a lot more interesting, or a much more fun way of interpreting events of the past if we can see it through the lens of these incredible narrators and these incredible creative minds. It's just a more fun and interesting way of interpreting events of the past. I would recommend any of the books that I mentioned here. I haven't read the Iliad since I was in 9th grade. I'll probably check that one out soon. I couldn't recommend I Saw Her That Night higher. I couldn't recommend Libra higher. Gravity's Rainbow, sure, check it out. It's quite long. You might enjoy it. Yeah, I don't know how to end the videos. That's the end of the video.